We're going to start in a few minutes, but because we often get squeezed on the far end, having to get out so a class can come in, we're a sort of a refreshments first, a food first sort of event. So please do help yourself to fruit, coffee, cheese. You can eat your
Do I have to do something to get that slide to go up?
No, that's it. How will technology and how will technology affect food workers in the next 10 years?
Okay.
And the text is screwed up there.
That's all right. This is enough information. I think I should go ahead and start.
Yeah, what time is it?
It's time.
4:07.
Is this on? Yes, I guess it is. Good afternoon, and welcome to the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute and to our book launch for Big Hunger, the Unholy Alliance between Corporate America and Anti-Hunger Groups. I'm really glad to see you here. We are a food-centered institution, so if you get the urge during the talk, feel free to ease over there and refill your fruit plate, or what have you. But I do want to get started because I think there's a lot to be said. I'm excited about this afternoon's program. I've been watching, listening to, in a sense, this book emerging from Andy over the course of years. It was a big task, and it's taken a while to come to fruition, and many of us who've been down that path remember what it's like. Andy Fisher is a leading national expert on community food security. He was both a founder and the director of the Community Food Security Coalition, and there are many people in this room and many people in our extended community who are beneficiaries of the work that Andy did in helping to secure community food security grant legislation. I know I served on one of the panels that read the grants and chose recipients, and it was a thrilling introduction to the kind of creative work that was going on in communities around the country. So I think we're all indebted to Andy for the work of the Community Food Security Coalition and for the great effort he has put into creating this book, and you can read more details in his bio. And we have two people that we're very privileged to have to respond to Andy's book. These are both people who could easily keep us all engaged for an entire session just on their own, and you know, I've given them 6 or 7 minutes each to respond to Andy's book. It's not quite fair. But after Andy speaks, first we will hear from Chef Greg Silverman, who is newly the director of the West Side Campaign Against Hunger, but has spent much of his adult life, as he puts it, cooking up change in communities across the globe. He has worked for the City of London. He has worked for Share Our Strength. He has worked for Wellness in the Schools. He has owned restaurants. And now we're glad to have him across the park in the West Side Campaign Against Hunger. And again, you can read details on the handy little bio sheet. And then his response will be followed by Tony LaCourie. Dr. LaCourie is the founder and executive director of School Food Focus, which works for food options for children in urban schools. And Tony and I go way back. It's kind of amazing to think how long Tony has been trying to improve the food that reaches the children, originally the children of New York City, and now the children of the nation through school food programs. So I think we're in for an stimulating and exciting afternoon, and I'm glad to see some CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute Forum regulars and some new faces in the audience, so please be welcome. Okay, Andy, will you come up and get us started with a little bit about how and why?
Sure. Thank you. Okay, so let me see. Okay. Okay. Great. Great. Thank you, Jan. Appreciate the invitation. You know, I wouldn't be here today, and a lot of us wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Jan and her work that she's done, and especially Sweet Charity, which she wrote about 20 years ago. It was really a seminal book that brought my attention and those of many other to the inadequacies of the emergency food system. And thank you for your groundbreaking work, Jan, and for having me here. Appreciate it. So, you know, just by way of kind of explanation, you know, as Jan said, I ran the Community Food Security Coalition for about 17 years, helped start it back in the early 90s, mid 90s. And since, you know, for the first 10 or 15 years of that organization, I was really involved in trying to move the anti-hunger community toward a community food security approach, towards more focus on public health and sustainable development and focusing on where the food came from. I saw a lot of really important strides during that period. I saw a lot of food banks moving toward a health focus, moving towards, you know, incorporating gardening and concerned about the quality of the food that they were distributing. But at the same time, I also saw a big disconnect between some of the national groups and how they were connected to big ag and big food companies. And I saw that causing problems in our fight towards against hunger and around obesity and sustainable agriculture. And as we all have seen, you know, an increasing amount of economic inequality as it's surged in recent decades. And that, you know, I saw that the anti-hunger community is perhaps the biggest part of civil society that has that issue in its scope. But so there's, you know, incredible potential, but incredible barriers at the same time. And then similarly, I saw a marked lack of public dialogue on the issues that I bring up in this book, of discontent with some of the way the food system, with the way food charity is being run. You know, there was that discontent publicly, but when you sit down with people over a cup of coffee or a beer, you get another level of truth. So this book, you know, brings a lot of those concerns to light, and it questions why we have failed as a society to solve hunger and asks if there could be a better way. And I want to start with Saturday. Last Saturday was the Postal Service's Stamp Out Hunger food drive. And I don't know if they do that here in New York City, but back in Portland where I live, they left a yellow plastic bag on my doorstep, and that I was supposed to fill with cans of whatever, and leave it for my letter carrier to bring back. And so, but I threw that bag in the recycling bin, and I want to tell you why. And the story starts with Orion. This is my son Orion. From back in 3rd grade, about 4 or 5 years ago. He is now 13, got a little mustache, a deep voice, nowhere near as nice as he was when he was 9 years old. But he came home one day, right before Christmas. There was a canned food drive in his school. And it was a competition between his classroom and a bunch of other classrooms in the school of who could A, raise the most money for Oregon Food Bank, and B, get the most amount of food by weight. So he comes in all excited, and he's just going into the cupboard and getting as much heavy food as he can, because that's what it's all about. It's all about pounds, right? So my wife's like, stop, you know, and she gives him a bunch of cans for him to take, and he's all happy, goes to school the next day, brings the cans. A week or two later, right before the deadline, I'm on my way out to the supermarket, and Orion's like, Dad, you need to get me some more heavy food. I need some more heavy food. You know, we're not winning yet. And I go, okay, fine, I'll get you some food. And so I'm in this grocery store, and I'm thinking, well, what's heavy, right? I go, you know, I could get him some Pepsi. Pepsi, 64-ounce bottle of Pepsi's heavy. I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to do it, but I get him some beans. And, you know, just before I get into kind of my analysis of this, I just want to say that his class did not win the contest for weight, but they did win it for money donated because there's some rich lawyers' kids in the class. So, so he got his pizza party, so he was happy, right? But you know, I realized as I was shopping at the supermarket, there was something that really was bugging me about this contest, and I realized that Orion's kind of little canned food drive competition in his school was kind of a microcosm of the problems that I see with the emergency food system. And part of those problems are that they measure their success in pounds and people. It's the number of pounds you distribute and the number of people you serve. And every year that's got to grow because that's the way food banks grow, and that's kind of like the capitalist inexorable logic. You know, you've got to distribute 5% more food this year than you did last year because that means you're succeeding. That means you're moving forward. And you know, I realized that free food it's really a Band-Aid. It's a Band-Aid on a societal cancer of income inequality. And then I also realized that pounds and people, if any of you do evaluation, they're outputs. They're not outcomes. It's kind of shoddy evaluation to be measuring your success with outputs rather than outcomes. It's like an AIDS prevention program, and we're sitting in a public health department, might as well go down this path. It's like an AIDS prevention program that measures its success in how many condoms it distributes or how many bus benches it buys, bus bench ads it buys. You know, that's not really the measure of success. The measure of success is the reduction of the prevalence of HIV. So, you know, similarly, I just finished a job where I was working as interim executive director at a group called Portland Fruit Tree Project, and it is a kind of a gleaning project where we go around to neighbors who don't want to pick their apple tree or their pear tree, and we pick it and we give it to food pantries. And I've been trying to move them away from this whole story about telling our story in terms of how many pounds we distribute and how many people we serve and how many volunteers we have. And it was very hard. It was really hard to move to figure out how to do that. It involved a level of sophistication that the organization didn't really have. And so, you know, we're kind of when I left, we were on kind of a dual track of still having to measure that and communicate that to our funders who were upset, some of whom were upset because we're actually reducing the number of pounds we were distributing this year as compared to last year. But, you know, we had to find alternative ways. So the food drive also brings up the issue that food is not the solution to hunger. It doesn't resolve the underlying problems of food insecurity. Peacekeepers will tell you just because there's an absence of hostilities, there's a truce, that doesn't mean you have peace. You all in the public health world know that the absence of disease doesn't equal health. So likewise, giving people a bag of food may end hunger today, so what about tomorrow? It's a symptom, hunger is a symptom of a much broader cause of poverty and all the social inequities that accompany it. And the approach of thinking about food as a solution to hunger really opens the door to a social service approach, when then what is really needed is to change the underlying situation, which is more of a social change approach. And then by defining that problem as hunger, we create an approach that perpetuates itself. If we need to give people food stamps or charity every month, we create this endless program that keeps people in hunger, but doesn't end it. It becomes more of a hunger maintenance industry. It's like a job training program. When you operate a job training program, you know, you expect there to be a finite end to it. And then people move on to getting a job, and that's, again, how you measure your success. No one expects to be operating a job training program for people until they're 65. With food banking, we're doing it that way. We're continuing and continuing, and there's never an end to it. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger. But, you know, all that said, you know, why am I so down on a nice little thing like my letter carrier schlepping around some bags of beans around town? You know, from one perspective, to be honest and be fair about this, you know, there's 200 plus food banks in the country. There's 60,000 food pantries and soup kitchens. They distribute $5 billion worth of food every year in virtually every corner of this country. They do, and they're a tribute to the astonishing ingenuity and dedication of American civil society. You know, food charity has become embedded in virtually every corner of America, in churches and schools and in the post office, in the Rotary Club. There's tens of millions of donors, and there's tens of millions of volunteers. It's quite the enterprise, and the mobilization that we've done over the years to feed the poor, given the cutbacks that we've had in food programs, is really quite impressive and quite astonishing. Also, I mean, it's not just civil society, it's not just individuals or the nonprofits, it's companies get in the game. And companies, large and small companies donate billions of dollars worth of food and cash every year to the effort, and not just in the food industry. It's not just supermarkets and food processors. It's Chase, it's JP Morgan, it's Nationwide Insurance. A lot of them do. And across most major sectors, corporations fund anti-hunger work. They do so largely because it's a cause in which they can be socially responsible, appear to be socially responsible, without challenging their profits. It's a sanitized approach to poverty reduction, essentially. So I question the end game. I question where we're going with this. We've been doing this since the early 1980s in a substantial way. What were really small food distribution efforts that started, in some cases, in unions to help workers laid off by the cutbacks in the early 1980s in places like my hometown in Youngstown, Ohio, has grown bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where we're distributing $5 billion worth of food every year. So food banks have become like museums or hospitals. They've become mainstream institutions in their community. But they've also become appendages of the food industry in many ways. They're preventing upstream solutions to poverty because those solutions challenge corporate profits. As a result, food banking comes with a side dish of collateral damage to human dignity. And let me tell you a story. As part of research for this book, I decided that I really needed to volunteer at a food pantry. So I talked to my friends at Oregon Food Bank, and I asked them, what was the best food pantry in my neighborhood? So they told me of this one place to go. It was a few miles from my house, so I started going there. And my very first day, I go in. It's in the bottom of a church. It's a shopping pantry. So that means it's like you just don't get a box of food. It's a basement of a church. It's laid out like a supermarket. You get your shopping cart, you roll through it, and you take stuff off the shelf and through the coolers, and it's got a nice assortment of stuff. And what you get is all based upon your household size. So my very first day, I go there, and I get my orientation. It's from this teenage girl who has purple hair, and she tells me that my job is to be a cross between a security guard, to make sure that people don't take too much, especially the meat, the high-value stuff, and a personal shopper to help people navigate the system. Fine. So I've got a 4-hour shift. I'm going through my shift. I'm about halfway through, and I come upon an elderly African-American couple. And, they've been sitting there for 2 hours on hard plastic chairs in a dingy church basement. They're looking tired. They're looking a little dejected. So I introduce myself, and I say, hi, how many people in your household? And they tell me. I grab a shopping cart. I start wheeling them through the layout, and I start telling them what they can take. You can take a can of tuna. You can take 3 cans of beans. You can take some potatoes, bag of spaghetti, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so as they're, trying to figure out what they want, I realize I'm hovering over their shopping cart, watching what they're taking. It's that security guard instructions in my head. And I realize that this is messed up. And I take a step back. And I realize I'm still watching what they're taking. I still got that security guard instructions in my head. And I realize this is just nuts. I'm a white middle-class guy. Here's this poor couple, and I feel like I just felt like it was oppressive. I feel like, I was wearing my race and class privileges on my sleeve, and I'm just making sure that these folks are just trying to get some food to get themselves through the week, don't throw a few extra potatoes into their basket. It was an experience that really, embodied for me. I really felt it, that there's an inherent power dynamic within the emergency food system that leads us towards oppression and racism. And let me show you a PSA from Feeding America, which is the nation's food banking hub. They're based in Chicago. We put a number of PSAs. This one is kind of a very sanitized approach to food pantries, but what I want you to particularly pay attention to is who has wings and who doesn't. You see that? Is that okay?
Every day across America, excess food is gathered by a network of good people at local food banks, giving hope to to millions of children who struggle with hunger. They've earned their wings, and you can too. Together, we can solve child hunger. Support Feeding America and your local food bank at feedingamerica.org.
What do you guys notice in terms of who has wings and who doesn't? The volunteers have wings, the recipients don't. You know, the volunteers are holy, they're the worthy, they're dignified, they become angels by the process of their work, whereas the recipients are not. They're, if you will, the undeserving poor. It's, you know, I think Robert Egger, who's the founder of DC Central Kitchen, has this wonderful quote, I think, that really kind of nails that really well. He talks about charity being about the redemption of the giver, not the liberation of the receiver. So charity then becomes death by 1,000 cuts to our dignity, you know, and that would be one thing if it was effective, but it really isn't. You know, by themselves, charity and even food stamps have not been effective at turning around the incidence of food insecurity. They're not enough, and hunger would be a whole lot worse if we didn't have them. I am not calling for abolition of charity or food stamps, but they're a stopgap and they're a safety net, and they can't solve the hunger problem without strategies that address poverty and broader social inequities. This slide is a chart of food insecurity. So USDA measures food insecurity, which is a measurement of behaviors and experiences related to kind of a scientific measurement of hunger, if you will. It's more behavioral and experiential related. They've been doing that since 1995. As you can see, the top line is food insecurity. The bottom line is very low food security. In 1995, food insecurity was at 12%. Very low food security was at 4%. The numbers go up and down every year based upon basically our economic cycles. Good times they go down, bad times they go up. But we're back down to, in 2015, in the last numbers, we're back down to almost exactly the same place as we were 20 years ago. So, you know, we're treading water. And the reason why we're treading water is because of wage stagnation. The minimum wage hit its highest level in 1968. If it had kept up with productivity, it would be over $18 an hour right now. 60% of households with kids and that are not elderly that receive food stamps have at least one wage earner. So economists will tell you that if you want to reduce food insecurity, you need to focus on the minimum wage. And you also need to fight for affordable housing, and you also need to focus on health care. Obviously, people have one budget. If they're spending all their money on housing, they're not going to have money for food. And medical bills are the #1 reason people go into bankruptcy. But virtually no food bank in America advocates for a raise in the minimum wage. This is Gloria McAdam. She used to be the CEO of Food Share in Hartford, Connecticut. She's upstate now, Malone, I believe. A wonderful woman. In a moment of truth, you know, she told me that, hey, look, we're mainstream, we're rich, we're respectable, and we're going to stay that way. So food banks stay in their nutrition safety zone, which is that area where, you know, focusing on nutrition policies and food stamps and TFAP and those things where they can avoid controversy. They don't get into immigration issues. They don't get into wage issues. They don't get into the Affordable Care Act, where they don't alienate their corporate donors or their board members. Sorry, that's in the wrong place. So I looked at I looked at 155 food banks online and found 2,800 food bank board members where I could find employment affiliation. And I found that of those 2,800 board members, almost exactly 1/4 worked for a Fortune 1000 company or its private sector equivalent. So basically the 1,000 largest companies in the country. This is a chart that shows the number of food bank board members per company, and this is from 2013, I believe. So you can get a sense of where they're coming from. But of those 2,800 food bank board members, again, 700-ish came from Fortune 1000 companies. Anybody want to guess how many worked at labor unions, or were members of labor unions, but worked for a labor union? Two, and they were for the same food bank out by Detroit. You know, Actually, I should go back to the slide. So Walmart has been one of the biggest donors to food banks in recent times. They committed about $2 billion over the past over a 5-year period from 2010 to 2015. They more than met that, mostly in product. This is the amount of money they gave over that time period to 3 of the largest anti-hunger organizations in the country. What I wanted to show you is kind of how, again, I want to show you another PSA from Feeding America that shows that this relationship between Walmart and Feeding America and the food industry. And this is airing now on TVs, and it's part of a current campaign in which food manufacturers and Walmart are giving Feeding America about $9 million through kind of every time you buy, a certain product, they'll donate a couple pennies off of it. But what I really want you to pay attention to is the types of food that you'll see in this ad.
What would you do if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and walk out on? Oh, baby, all I need is my
All right, so those of you who are like my age probably remember John Belushi, how he's imitating Joe Cocker. So my joke is that John Belushi's probably rolling over in his grave somewhere. I mean, it's just weird. It's a stoner song, first of all. I get high with a little help from my friends, but this type of marketing is called cause marketing. Queens College professor Mara Einstein wrote a book called Compassion, Inc., which calls this type of marketing a deliberate deception. It teaches us that the solution to hunger is buying stuff, not being citizens. That's problematic in and of itself. But to use Pop-Tarts to fight hunger, to me, is shocking. Why is it okay, sitting here in a public health school, why is it okay to promote the consumption of unhealthy foods among the general public to provide free, sometimes healthy, sometimes unhealthy foods to the poor? Where's the fundraising ethics in a PSA like that? So the point I'm trying to reinforce here is that anti-hunger work has become big business, and big business profits from anti-hunger work. It's not just in charity, but it's also in federal food programs. They're integrally tied to the support for the food industry. One more slide I should reinforce that I should show is that these are the highest salaries for food bank CEOs throughout the country that I was able to find. Again, reinforcing that people are making large amounts of money off of this work. So there's 15 federal food programs in all. This is some of the larger ones. In the U.S., we spend about $95 to $100 billion on federal food programs, school lunch, breakfast, WIC, SNAP, et cetera, et cetera. As part of this, the U.S. Department of Agriculture spends about $2 billion a year on commodities for distribution to schools, the aged, and other low-income persons. And the vast majority of these funds are going to those companies that dominate the food industry: Walmart, ConAgra, Tyson, Kraft, Pepsi, et cetera. And I call that connection between big ag and food, USDA, and the anti-hunger groups, the hunger industrial complex. It's similar to President Eisenhower's speech back in 1961 that warned the public about the military-industrial complex. And this complex, sure, it feeds the poor, absolutely essential work, but it also leaves behind a trail of health, environmental, and social collateral damage. So let's take a look at just a little piece of that complex. Tyson is the largest seller to USDA Foods. It sold $106 million in 2014. Tyson and JBS, which is a Brazilian conglomerate that owns Pilgrim Pride, they received 2/3 of the chicken contracts from USDA during that period, but they only control about 40% of the chicken market overall. Tyson is well known for its exploitative practices, especially with farmers who raise chicken for it. All too often, those farmers are driven into bankruptcy by Tyson's manipulative contracts. And we see that in 2/3 of the counties in where Tyson operates, that the per capita income is lower than the state average. We also see a pattern of worker abuses, where Tyson had 220 OSHA violations from 2007 to 2015. Chris Leonard is a journalist who wrote a book called The Meat Racket. He wrote that Tyson is feeding off the lowly economic position of rural America, not improving it. And Tyson is also, a large contributor to anti-hunger causes. It claims to have distributed 100 million pounds of food to food banks in a 5-year period and has funded the same national anti-hunger groups as Walmart. It even penned an op-ed with FRAC. It works with anti-hunger groups in the American Commodity Distribution Association, which lobbies Congress and USDA for, among other things, increased funding for commodity purchases. So, SNAP, the food stamp program, is what I would call Tide Aid, which is a term that comes out of the international development community. It's linked to the support of the food industry, like international food aid. So, in the U.S., we don't distribute cash to a country that needs food aid, which is what the most of the rest of the world does. We give them grain. So we'll ship grain grown in Iowa or wherever on American flagged ships because it supports our farm economy and our shipping industry. And it's the same thing with SNAP. A core feature of SNAP is that it doesn't come in the form of a cash payment. It comes in the form of a subsidy to the food industry. So, if we had a society in which food was recognized as a human right, we wouldn't have the anti-hunger sector lobbying with the food industry. We would see the food stamp program with its $66 billion a year differently. It wouldn't just be about feeding people whatever the marketplace provides, but it would use its purchasing power to change the food system itself towards healthier and more sustainable products. To give you some context, that $66 billion is about 10% of the total amount Americans spend on groceries. So SNAP expenditures would lead the market instead of follow the market. It could be used as a funding source to leverage change in the marketplace, similar to the way that California has done in the environmental realm by mandating the use of electric vehicles on the roads before that technology was available. So, but in terms of forcing the marketplace, I'm not talking about cosmetic changes. I'm not talking about putting fiber in Coke, which is what's being proposed right now. I think Coke is developing that product, as well as they have Diet Coke that has vitamins in it. That's like putting lipstick on a pig. I'm talking about connecting the huge market that's SNAP with agricultural policies that can shift pricing structures, reinvigorate local regional food systems, and regenerative agriculture. And SNAP recipients would then have incentives to purchase healthy foods, and they'd also have strong incentives to not to purchase ultra-processed foods that cause harm to their health. Supermarkets would be mandated, if they wanted to redeem SNAP, to create health-oriented retail environments that would benefit all persons, not just food stamp recipients. Policy changes would reinvigorate local food systems to create the supply, while SNAP would foster the demand. So, but why should we go down this path? Why bother? Why tinker with something that may be working right now? And research has shown that small and medium-sized businesses are more effective at reducing poverty, at increasing tax revenues, at protecting the environment, and generating per capita income than larger businesses. It makes sense that local businesses with local owners are going to be more responsive to their communities than large corporations. So investing public resources in local businesses can help solve the problem in double time. It also makes for a more democratic food system. There's a gentleman in England, a British scholar, his name is Kevin Morgan. He writes about the power of the public plate. And he writes about how public procurement can transform the food system. He talks about the need to procure food with values, not just a good value, to focus on more than cheapness, but to focus on food that is produced in a way that supports an economy that supports ecological protection. And we're seeing that happen in small but growing ways here in the U.S. First of all, the farm to school is now reaching about 30% of school kids with at least one local food item per day. School Food Focus, as Tony's going to talk about, has worked with George Washington University and Pew Charitable Trust and food manufacturers to develop and promote a label related to the responsible use of antibiotics for the chicken industry. And that is leading the way toward broader acceptance of that practice by poultry farmers and by the chicken industry outside of the school food system. There's a program that USDA operates called FDPIR, FDPIR, Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations. It's the program that serves the most isolated and poorest of Native Americans. It's those folks who qualify for SNAP but don't have a grocery store to go to because there isn't one in their community. So it gives them a box of commodity foods. And FIDPER, USDA buys $100 million worth of food for FDPIR every year. And only recently did it incorporate into its food package on a permanent basis foods such as bison, wild rice, blue corn, and salmon. And those are foods that are traditional, but they also have native producers. And so the economic development potential is huge for using those funds to develop the native agricultural sector and to reduce poverty and the need for the program in the first place. We're also, and to be fair, we're also seeing a lot of change in the food banking industry. A lot of food banks are moving towards a health promotion. They're moving towards economic development. I found out recently in Minnesota, when I was speaking in Minneapolis, the Second Harvest Food Bank, one of their staff told me that Feeding America is grappling with putting an advocacy piece on wages in its strategic plan. So things in some ways, are really moving in the right direction. There's a greater acceptance of health and a greater acceptance of economic justice. We need to accelerate and we need to push that innovation. So the bottom line on federal food programs, though, is if we don't value the harm that companies like Tyson and Walmart are doing to our environment, to our rural communities, to our farmers and workers, then why are we investing our $100 billion of public resources in them? Why are we supporting them when the very product that they offer, cheapness, comes with a side dish of collateral damage? It's time to invest in food that not only nourishes, but also creates a sustainable and democratic food system. So I just want to summarize and move towards a conclusion here. We have not been, as a nation, we have not been very effective in reducing food insecurity. We've caused damage to people's dignity. We've reinforced the obesity and diabetes epidemics and reinforced economic concentration in the food system. We've misled the public about how to solve hunger. We've diminished the public's imagination on actually how to solve the problem. And we've missed huge organizing opportunities and contributed in some ways towards Trump's election by not changing the dynamics and not changing the narrative in the Rust Belt. So all of that is what we get. And I don't mean this facetiously. I mean this very seriously. All of that is what we get in the name of the incredibly important and the incredibly urgent goal of averting hunger. That's the cost we've had to pay. But I think there's got to be a better way. So here's what I think we need to do. First of all, let me state unequivocally that charity is not justice. Charity is what a society does when there is no justice. And what we need is a whole lot more justice and a whole lot fewer canned food runs. So first of all, we need to make food banking obsolete. Not that we need to get rid of food banks tomorrow, but in 20 years, let's create long-term strategic plans, get food banks out of the transactional business, get them into distributing food only in true emergencies, to institutions that need food, social service agencies, domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, schools, et cetera, et cetera. One benchmark to do that is to get food banks to put 10% of their budgets to policy and community organizing within 5 years. And just kind of by way of comparison, Oregon Food Bank has the largest public policy department in the country. They spend 4% of their budget on policy. So it's a push, it's a stretch, but we need to make it happen. Let's try to get 50% of food bank budgets to upstream causes by 2030. Again, let's put a moratorium on canned food drives. Let's stop building bigger food bank buildings. It's like building another pipeline or another coal plant when we're trying to stop climate change and wean ourselves off the fossil fuel industry. If you build it, you're going to use it. This Organized Freedom 90 chapters, I'm sorry, that's from a previous slide. If Freedom 90 is a kind of an organizing effort in Canada in which food pantry volunteers have come together and advocated to the province of Ontario that they need to make food banking obsolete. What else can we do? On the federal food programs, we need to protect and increase SNAP. The Republicans are going to be pushing hard to block grant SNAP. We need to stop that. SNAP is essentially is incredibly vital to food security of people now, and it fulfills the government's commitment to the right to food. And we also need to increase that funding if possible. But we also need to encourage innovation. We can't stop. We need to be looking at ways to improve the nutritional profile of SNAP. For food stamp recipients to spend $6.5 billion on soda is not tenable. That status quo is not benefiting anybody except for the soda companies. And then, as Kevin Morgan says, we need to be thinking about how to use those programs to get values for our dollar, not just value. Again, to move away from cheapness, let's find ways to encourage the purchases of food that get us towards the economy and get us toward the society that we want. So, I think here in New York City, thinking about Occupy Wall Street, we need to occupy hunger. We need to take it back from corporations. We need to redefine anti-hunger work, have it focus on economic justice, health, and local economies. I'm a big fan of Why Hunger here in New York City, which is kind of a backbone organization of a lot of efforts to move in this direction. They have a network of food banks that they're supporting called Closing the Hunger Gap. They do a biannual conference, which will be in Tacoma, Washington, September. It's a great opportunity for those of you who are in the anti-hunger field to go and hear and see and participate with 500 of your colleagues who are doing some very progressive work. And I have a book out, so I am selling books in the back. I encourage you to read it and talk about it. Talk about it in your book clubs, in your organizations. Start discussion groups. What we really need. I mean, the purpose why I wrote this thing and why I'm out here on the road is because I believe we need to spark a dialogue. I believe there needs to be a dialogue about how we do hunger, how we address hunger in a more sustainable and more effective way. So thank you.
Greg is next. I'm just trying to think if we want to, I think we'll wait until you and Tony have responded, and then we'll. Yes. But would you rather stand?
No, that's good.
Good afternoon. I'm Greg Silverman. That was a lot to take in. I'm going to try to be really quick, so there's more questions and dialogue. Obviously, a lot to say, but obviously there's much more to do in our work ahead. For me, the big takeaway here, and I guess where I have a difference of thought on this is, there's a lot of talk about the or. Is it social change or social service? I'm much more of a and. Like, we need all of these things. We need more radical solutions. We need more continued on-the-ground work. I mean, maybe it comes from, I'm a chef. I like to cook. I like to feed people. It's very simple for me. Maybe that's why I work in hunger. I don't think of fighting hunger as the answer to poverty. I think of it as part of the battle, part of the larger war on poverty. So there's solutions, but they're not the big solutions with a capital S. And I think we have to be able to separate those pieces out. When I first had restaurants in Ithaca, New York, I always built these communal tables. And a lot of times I realized at my highest end restaurant, the customers didn't want to go to the communal table. I was trying to create community, trying to bring people to the table, but customers do what they wanted. When I fast forward to being in Washington, D.C., in what has been, and I guess they say that hundreds of years ago they did drain that swamp, and they continue to talk about that. I always go back, when I first moved there, to this idea of this Nietzsche quote of, you got to swim with the frogs to get to the swamp. And I truly believe that. Like, you got to be at the table with everyone and not be afraid to sit at that table. And so I worked for No Kid Hungry, Share Our Strength. I can definitely 100% let you know that I saw a budget line item that I was 100% paid for by the Walmart Foundation. So I say that not as a negative, I say it as a positive. When I lived in Ithaca, I looked at across the way from my house and I saw them building this Walmart, and I couldn't believe that our small, sleepy, liberal town was going to have this monstrosity come into our community. And so I had these notions when I went to the swamp of DC and dealing with policy folks and what I realized was the part of the swamp that wasn't a swamp was dealing with big business, because helping grow and run the largest nonprofit nutrition education program in the nation, Cooking Matters, we were able to extend our reach and push hard, and we were pushed very hard by the Walmart Foundation. And the push was about not just having outputs, but having outcomes and doing really deep and dense evaluation and measurement. And little foundations and little nonprofits don't have the ability to do that, and we have a lot of wasted dollars in our system. We have lots of good little programs doing nice little work, but they're actually not effective. And so we really need, partly, yes, we need money to do that, and sometimes our partners have that, and they were really powerful partners for us, pushing us really hard to see what we could do. At the same time, I definitely felt our team was able to push back. No one was telling us what not to argue with the Walmart Foundation. My push was, I actually want to get out of the Walmart Foundation, and I want to talk directly to Walmart, the corporate groups and their wellness groups. And when I was running grocery store tours, we said we want to talk to every single Walmart manager, for example, in the state of Maryland, and we want to implement wellness activities because we've seen from our evaluation what our grocery store tours can do, funded by the foundation. But we were able to take that and be at the table and have really concerted efforts and discussions with this corporate group. Do I agree with everything that group has done? Of course not. But being at the table, to me, is really important. Whether it's talking to policy people, whether it's being in the White House, like, we have to give, this idea of, and Sam Cass said it best, right? Like, we have to have carrots and sticks. And I think a lot of Andy's discussion is about what the bigger sticks we need are. I think I obviously, from a feeding perspective as a chef, I like giving carrots. Like, I want people to enjoy my food, and so, but not carrot sticks. Because my big issue with carrot sticks is that people don't know how to chop anything, and they're buying these little, but that's a whole other issue. But when you think about, so I was at this sort of interesting table in D.C. More recently, I run the West Side Campaign Against Hunger. We're one of the larger emergency food pantries in New York City. We created the customer choice model almost over 30 years ago. I don't like that phrase, emergency food pantry. It's not an emergency why people come to us anymore, right? It's supplemental food. And this has been going on, I agree, for decades. And so it's a supplemental program, and it's not going away tomorrow. No matter what policy change we make, we're not going to be able to make it in the next 5 or 10 years. So we need to be ready to sit at the table and make the short-term changes we need to make. At the same time, we're not a pantry. You can come visit us. We're a grocery store. You come in, and we just don't charge people money, but we have fresh produce, we have fresh meats, we have dairy. And we do have volunteers at our food pantry, at our supermarket. Most of our volunteers are customers. So the same people who are shopping are also volunteers. Do we have corporate groups coming in? The vast minority. Out of 30,000 hours of volunteers, pretty much all of them are our customers. And they inform how we do our work. And that's a difference. And so we every day have lunch in our pantry, and it's our staff and our customer volunteers eating together, sharing a meal together. And it's what it's taken me probably 15 years to get from creating a table that no one would sit at to being at the big corporate table that didn't have the community members, to seeing that even in this food pantry, we have the ability to bring people together, and we're all sitting at the table together making choices. Our board has members who are customers and volunteers. Every part of everything we do involves our community, and it's not low income, high income. It's the people who are part of this change making process. And I think that was a big push when I was at Share Our Strength. We kept trying to do is, how do we make, for example, in childhood hunger, how do you make children into the army of advocates, right? That's who we need making change. It's not about us in this room, screaming at our Congress people. It's about the people who are actually in need doing that. And I think that is the shift that needs to happen. And places like pantries have an ability to do that if we bring the people together in the right way. So in my mind, it's about more carrots and more sticks. It's not an either or. And I just, I love the book, and I just want to make sure we're all seeing that there's a lot of solutions that need to happen.
It's working? Really? No, it's not? There it is. There it is. So I just wanted to start from, my name is Toni Lapori, and I'm the founder and executive director of School Food Focus. And people are telling me to focus my voice on this microphone, so I'm going to try to do that. And Andy, I just wanted to start by sharing a story between the two of us, that I had told you I felt inspired reading your book, and you said to me back on email, well, that's a first. So I thought I should, that's what I meant, yeah. But I thought I should explain myself a bit. And it really has to do with the fact that I've been doing community-based work of various kinds, not just school food, over the years. And I did have a 5 to 6 year stint inside of the emergency food system here in New York back in the early 90s. And I guess while there are many differences between the systems of emergency food and school food, there was just so much resonance in your book. And some of your analysis, especially Chapter 5, was so helpful to me. School Food Focus is a small not-for-profit. We're 10 people when we're large. Half of us live in New York, and the other half are scattered around the country. And really, our focus is as a catalyst for school food change. And the way that we're doing this is really by trying to connect differently, both the supply and the demand. So if you can think for a bit about Kevin Morgan's public procurement and just the school food slice of it, that's the demand part in our world. Whereas the food supply is much larger, and that's the supply. So the question is, how do you connect these in ways that make sense for the health of people and the health of the planet, right? We, inside of Focus, represent 46 of the larger districts in the country, and that's how we started. And this represents about $600 million of purchasing power, if you look at it generally. Over the last 4 years, when we've been working at our highest gear, we've probably, the districts that we work with on this, and 27 of them in that larger universe, have been doing this procurement change work to the tune of tens of millions of dollars of changes in their practice. We're not trying to do one-offs. We're trying to figure out in a systems way how these districts can change what it is they're doing. And there's got to be buy-in for this. And the buy-in from them, when we first started back in 2008, was we used the language of healthy, regional, and sustainable. They get it with healthy, right? Regional was a little bit of a push, and sustainable we had to speak about very quietly most of the time. But still, you know, we were in a learning process with them. And I have to say, after this period of time, when I look back, and we've had a chance recently to look back at what the changes have been, we've sort of taken a lot of instruction from these districts about what they wanted to do, or else you're not going to get buy-in, right? And these are districts that I think of them as our early adopters, really. They kind of get healthy, hunger-free kids, and they can deal with all of that craziness and minutia, and they deal with it pretty well. Where they wanted to go was really in two interesting directions when you look back at what these purchasing changes have been. One set of them was really in the supply chains. So before this food gets to the distributors, you know, out in the fields. The other side of it had to do with processing. So if you look at the changes these folks have made, like the slide that you showed with the certified responsible antibiotic use, we ended up with Pew and George Washington University putting a standard in place that is for the institutional market. And these districts have, they now access that at price points that they can afford. The current kind of standard that's out there that's much more known than ours is one that's called no antibiotics ever. That doesn't have enough supply for these large districts to really buy into it, and the price points are way too high to buy into it fully. So coming at the level of this responsible antibiotic use standard, which really speaks to antibiotic resistance, which was what their question was in the beginning. What is this all about? And we did a lot of learning together to figure out what it was about. And this standard is set up so that it only speaks to the medical or the human antibiotics. So I don't want to go too much in the weeds there, but that's a good half of the kinds of changes that have been made. On the other side is the fact that too much of the food that comes into our school food programs, and I'd say across the board in all of our public food programs, are very highly processed, right? And they wanted to get at that. How do we get at that? And so we've done a number of initiatives to get at that. And when you step back from this and look at it, the guidelines that we have in place are silent on processing, on all the additives into our foods. They're silent on what happens in the supply chains. And because of that, this food just flows right through, and you can check all the boxes on healthy, hunger-free kids, right? So because we got to work with these folks so closely and set up the kind of relationships that any of this work has to be built on, we got to those kind of places. And even here in New York City, the school food program here does participate in one of our labs, and I just checked the data because we checked, the districts involved in all of this submit their data to us so that we can show them over time how they're changing. And really, for the chicken here in New York City, you still have a lot of highly processed, but you've got much more whole, much more minimally processed, according to your records. And so to us, that's a victory. We're not out here to damn the school districts or the industry. We're just here to say, let's get this together. This is really ridiculous what we're feeding our kids. And so that's how we've proceeded. So a lot of what you had to say was it just resonated in so many ways. This work is so hard. I've never done this is really hard work. And too much of the time it comes down to a lot of transactional work, and I forget the community behind us. But if it weren't for that community involved, we wouldn't be where we are in this kind of work. And the thing that I'm happiest to share with you, Andy, is that while we started with those specifics around healthy, regional, and sustainable, now we have the CRAU standard, so we can really chalk that right up there. We've come through a strategic planning process, and we're going to be adapting. We're in a strategic partnership now with the Center for Good Food Purchasing, and it's that center who we've introduced to many of the districts in our network that is working on 5 core values. So here's where you get to the values. Values around nutrition and really the extent of processing that we're seeing, animal welfare, economic impact, environmental impact, and labor. And so they've got a suite of metrics that one could use in following that. And since most of our food system is so untransparent, it's a black box for sure. I'm not sure how many of those will track, but in the future, we're going to branch out in that way. And I just, you just inspired me because of your analysis and because I could see that on the public side of our programs, we too are moving in the direction that you're talking about. So thank you.
Thank you to both Greg and Tony for thoughtful responses. We're going to open it up for your questions. I just want to find out if Andy had anything you wanted to say in response to these two.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. No, I'm really appreciative that you brought Greg here and for your coming, Greg. Just said, I'm really trying to engage in a dialogue, and I very much appreciate your comments. And I just wanted to say I totally agree that it needs to be both and not just either or. And that's I think what I'm trying to move. I think where we need to move. And what I've seen, unfortunately, has been the either or approach. And I'd like to see the inclusion of both social change and social services under a single roof. And folks like Nick Saul and who's organizing a set of community food centers across Canada embodies that approach very well.
So, hear from you.
The problem of the corporate place in this is not just for food, it's in the environmental realm and in other needs. They obviously, when they get the free publicity, they also get all kinds of tax and other incentives on that. You have the example of Walmart, which is the #1 community killer, #1 exporter of American manufacturing jobs. How in this period, when we have an assault on everything, including attempts to, quote unquote, buy American and buy locally, which becomes a social and environmental imperative to get things sourced as close as possible, to get things as a more appropriate scale so that more people can actually benefit. Do you have any thoughts of how we get there when everybody's stuck just, putting out fires or creating a firewall right now?
I guess I'll take a stab at it first, since I have the microphone in my hand. I think that that's very much a struggle that I found myself in after the election, in the sense of we know that we're all going to be circling the wagons to protect what's there. Paul Ryan, it came out in terms of wanting to block grant SNAP and through the through budget reconciliation. So we know that there's going to be that urgent need to defend what the progressive policies that we've accomplished over the past 40 or 50 years. And that is going to take a lot of energy and a lot of time. I think the point is that we're also in a point where we're learning that what we've done hasn't worked. So it's the challenge. I think it's the challenge of how to protect what we have, but also find the time and energy and the creativity to innovate. And I've been working in the anti-hunger community for 25 years, and I've heard since I started in this work right around the contract with America happened with Newt Gingrich, and there was an immediate resistance to doing any kind of changes to the SNAP program. And we were trying to gain passage of, Jan mentioned, a small community food project grant of $5 million a year, $2.5 million a year. There was an immediate resistance to doing that kind of thing because they didn't want to open the door to any changes. So it's been a narrative of resistance to change over 25 years. But I think, I think it's clear at this point we need to try to do something differently.
I would just want to say that I think that the process that Tony described is, it's not that you're safe from the assault on everything, as you put it, but it's a long-range pattern or plan for change that can probably endure some setbacks. Schools have to procure food, and it's conceivable that we would lose the school food programs, but unlikely. I think that we would out and out lose the school food. So they have to procure food. Are they going to do it in ways that that further the values, or are they going to go back to a business as usual? And I think that's a model that could withstand.
Yeah, and this wouldn't be business as usual, but one of the newer initiatives inside Focus is a cross-sector procurement change project, where school districts and hospitals in California, of course, are working together on this. And I have to say that that one has inspired me, in that I'm just ashamed relative to hospitals, what the amount of money that they have for their procurement versus what we have for our children. It's appalling. And really an analysis of the whole public sector and these ridiculous procurement hoops. We were so pleased, well, I don't know if we were pleased about the 6 cents the last time with CNR, but really, to really do what needs to be done in terms of wholesome food with the values that we're suggesting is much more than that. So I'm glad I have the model, at least of the hospitals, to make me think wider.
While you're brewing your questions, I'm going to pose one. Because I'm thinking about the procurement, Greg and Nick and Craig and I were actually talking about procurement for food pantries in New York City earlier this afternoon, and they could also subscribe to the good food purchase standards. So I can see how it works in programs where there is purchase of food. But tell me how it can work in SNAP. Tell me how we can use the $66 billion, $70 billion a year of SNAP purchasing power to move the food system in the direction we want it to go.
$4 billion. That's a huge question. If I knew, I would have written about that more. I think we can do it.
Chapter, what's your
Epilogue or whatever. You know, I don't have a great answer for you. I think what I was more trying to do is pose that possibility and that question of how that would happen. I guess what I would see is that SNAP would be linked up to agricultural policies that would promote the supply, that would build the supply of local and regional food, and that there would be some mechanism which would encourage people to purchase those foods and to bring down their cost as well as if there's, this is above my pay rate in thinking about how the structure of pricing within the food system. Why is it that fruits and vegetables are more expensive than potato chips? So how do we invert the pricing structure? Can we use that $100 billion of money to change the fundamental dynamics of the system? I don't have a great answer for it, but I think it's an important question.
I can take a little step into it just because I've been looking at it so closely recently. I mean, the whole of the Center for Good Food, those, let's just call them the 5 core value areas. The whole of it is now going through a revision based on the elegant work that was done while they were part of the LA Food Policy Council. And I think the revision will be done by the end of the summer, as I understand it. You would need to understand that that whole vision is massive. And so could you change it immediately? No. But what I think strategically, at least what we think we might be doing, is selecting out the particular pieces that we think we can deal with now in our current situation. So you could apply that to policy, but you could apply it to food pantries. You need to think through what is possible, what's the more likely way to approach with this. And it takes a lot of talking with industry, actually, which is not always, it's a new thing. It certainly has been a new thing for us. But in the end, the industry wants a market. And so since they want a market, we could deliver a market if we could come to terms with something. But I would say it would happen over time.
I guess if I put the first two questions together, there's this side of, you have, in the second part, SNAP, which is the biggest dollar value, and you put the other programs together, and they're all under assault, right? Like, we're all putting out fires, and there's going to be further fires related to WIC and SNAP and school meals. You put them all together, and everyone starts breaking down in silos. This is what happens in Washington, right? And then the hunger community fights against the obesity community, and no one can actually come together. And this is the fraying of what little safety net we have. And so we have to weave that net together. And I think this is where innovation could happen to say, different places like, thinking about what happens at summer meals. Do we need as many summer meals if we could increase money for SNAP in the summer for people? Like, how these programs can work together. The problem is we're so ready to put out these fires that we don't realize that we're all going to lose. So we're going to have to sacrifice a little bit, but we're going to have to sit at the table together to think through some of these solutions that we haven't wanted to do in the past.
I do think the health bucks, double up food bucks, SNAP incentive programs are a tiny step, but I don't see. Okay, more questions. Yeah, Nick.
Thank you all. It seems to me maybe an underlying theme of the remarks that all of you made and of your book
is what do we want from the public sector around food, and what are we willing to concede to the market and the private sector? And unlike education, where I think we've recognized that there needs to be a national conversation about what's the role of the public sector in education, certainly in elementary and secondary education, and what do we want for the role of the private sector. We've not had that conversation so much about food. And I wonder if each of you could talk a little about maybe, how could we engage in that conversation? Is there a chance that that conversation could move us out of the siloed approach of talking about each thing separately? And also, are there some opportunities to talk about a public sector in food at the time that Trump and the conservatives in Washington are attacking all our food programs?
Thank you. Let's invite first. Right. And I'll start only because a couple of years ago I went to the annual meetings of the Association for the Study of Food and Society, which I do whenever it's a really great meeting, the best field trips ever. But anyway, Daniel Bowman-Simon gave this. Thank you. Daniel Bowman-Simon gave this paper on SNAP, comparing it to PXs and BXs, base exchange, the supermarkets or mega markets on military bases where our service members get to shop at approximately 1/3 less the cost than what comparable things cost out in regular markets, and showed that it was about the same degree of subsidy that SNAP provides to households. I mean, the way you figure SNAP benefit levels has a lot to do with, and it made me think about, why had I never thought about a set of public supermarkets that competed, in a sense, with the private sector markets by offering healthy foods at lower costs? So maybe that's something. I mean, this is not obviously something that I've thought through, and I'm ready to submit my design. Although I'd like it to be a daycare center and a cafe. But anyway, but maybe we need to begin to look at those models. There are some in Brazil that work somewhat on that model and make food available at lower costs, healthy, especially fresh produce. So let's start.
The only thing I would add is maybe it's a time for us to, again, look outward instead of inward at America as having the answers. Like we might have been in a nice, sunny period with our former First Lady and creation of Let's Move, but when we start diving into that a little further, we kind of went to the lowest common denominator in some ways, right? Like Let's Move was built off an idea from England called Change for Life, which was much stronger, which is built off an even stronger community level approach in France. And maybe instead of having it at the national level, we need to break back down into some of these local areas and think about some solutions. And I know Barbara Turk sitting here, as we've talked somewhat about this idea of like, is scale about the federal level? Sometimes scale is about local things. And if we can make solutions at a local level, not that we can just forget about what's happening in Washington, but I think we have to find solutions that work. And I think we can't be afraid to not go big.
The only thing I'm going to add to that is I've been kind of toying around. Am I going to write another book? And what I'm really entranced by is can we think about food as a public good? You know, we regulate as utilities water, electricity, power, gas, I suppose. But we never. But food has historically been left to the private sector, and why has, I'd love to really find out why that's the case, and is there a case to be made for regulating supermarkets to be in the public sector as a public utility? If a supermarket chain wants to locate in a wealthy neighborhood, it also has to serve a low-income neighborhood. It really needs to be thought of more of a kind of as a health provider than just a private enterprise.
I saw another hand for a question over there. Yes.
This is actually a nice segue into my question. Greg, when you were describing the food pantry, it reminded me of a co-op in the system, which I know that members have to buy into, but that they can shop there and then they volunteer there. So also thinking about opening up supermarkets like we were just talking about into the public sector, is there a role that that co-op model can play in the food banks? And then also zooming out of that sort of elitism that might be labeled onto co-ops and that element of food sustainability and going local to kind of like destigmatize that model for hunger, approaches to hunger.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say yes. Simply put, I mean, this is what we do at our food pantry, right? Like, we are a co-op model. It was interesting yesterday. We had Fiddlehead Ferns in our grocery store. We had lots of upstate New York. We had beets and we have carrots and we have greens, like hardy greens that are from New York farms. Are we making little signs that say, like, brought to you by Stick and Stone Farm or Remembrance Farm and Farmer John? No, because we don't really care. We just know that it's great food and that our people in our community want great food. And because actually, more than at most grocery stores, our customers actually cook, which is really shocking in today's grocery stores. So, like, we don't need to highlight it because people are cooking on Saturdays just for fun. Our people are cooking every day. So I think we are an example of that. And I think there's more and more pantries and groups who are pushing in that direction.
And I think that's a message you need to get out more widely, because I think there's a stereotype that says low-income people, pantry users, are not cooking. So despite the great work of Share Our Strength Fund and Cooking Matters.
I had reason to be interviewing a food manager for the school that I went to high school in, which is in rural Michigan. It is a very small town within a county which has very low population. They have the opposite problem that New York City schools have in getting food to their schools, because although they're surrounded by farms, there's lots of fresh fruit and vegetables, they are a small purveyor, or they're a small buyer, and they have no ability to store food either. And so I uncovered a solution that I thought was very clever. And I thought that I would share it with you just because it might be useful and might not be useful, but shows that there are different ideas for different situations. So their situation is they have plenty of fruit. This is the fruit belt of Michigan, but they don't want to have that fruit go to the distributor, have the distributor dump tons of apples on them, and then they have nothing to do with them. So what they do is that the farmer makes an arrangement with a distributor, which is only financial. The distributor takes care of all the paperwork, all the money issues, takes responsibility that the apples will get there. What the school does is tell the farmer, okay, I need a new load of apples this week. I need a new load of apples in 2 weeks after that. The farmer provides which apples are the best for that season and brings them directly to the school. They unload them, and the kids get the best fruit from anywhere.
That's very interesting. So that the distributor is doing the paperwork and management function that a lot of farmers aren't equipped to do or don't want to do.
Right.
And
I do not think that this is a plan that was devised by the state of Michigan. Local plan that work out before.
another thing.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. Yeah, big fan of everyone's work, and I'm looking forward to reading this. I just wanted to share an example of how complicated this is. Am I echoing in the mic? Should I speak
No,
closer?
just have to talk real close to it.
Really close to it. Okay. So after I got a degree in critical geography, I found myself working for a community action agency, and they were grappling with a lot of the same problems. They're dedicated to economic justice, but they also run food pantries. that get their food from a food bank that is, mucking around with U.S. agricultural commodities. But that food bank also runs an organic farm because they want to bring people real food. They're also connecting people to WIC and SNAP programs, and doing all this great kind of emergency basic needs work, but they were continually, in some ways, not meeting their mission because they had no ability to engage in the advocacy work that you're asking for, to advocate for better wages, basically. Their grants didn't allow them to do that. Sometimes it was a stipulation of federal grants that they not engage in any advocacy work. So I was wondering where that funding could come from for this very, very important advocacy work. Thank you.
If food banks are going to be expected to move their work into different areas, you're right, absolutely right. They need money to do it, and the distribution part of it is kind of the engine that moves the train. Right. No, and it's hard. I mean, to do some things, you have to stop doing others, and that's a hard decision to make, obviously. And I'm not in your shoes, so I can't tell you that what's the right thing to do or what the wrong thing to do. But I think as part, what I didn't say, as part of an effort to encourage food banks to put increasing amount of their money into policy or to community organizing, there's got to be funding coming from that. So there's got to be. I'm about to write an article for the Chronicle of Philanthropy with Robert Egger that basically makes that case that funders need to put 10% of the money that they dedicate to food banks, to emergency food, into policy advocacy as well. So there's got to be, supply and demand need to go together, essentially, if you will.
I would add, as someone we have 19 staff at the Westside Campaigning Against Hunger, full-time staff. We have a full-time advocacy coordinator. Yes, we have some grants that are specifically for food, but we raise money. That's what nonprofits have to do. We have to raise money, and our board pushed us to say, this is important, and therefore you will raise money for this. And is it always isolated for we are raising money for this advocacy person? No. We run events, we push money towards these pieces. This is the beauty of unrestricted funds. This is where a part of it is pushing funders to say, you know what, it's not about giving very restricted, specific grants. An organization probably knows best what they need. So let's get more unrestricted funds, which allows us to push to advocacy, which helps us get more customers. A lot of our advocates, we have one staff member, multiple of our culinary students, our folks who are customers, they are our advocates. We're training them, helping them become better speakers to get out there and do press conferences. So I think you just have to be a bit creative.
And if I can just add one more thing on that, I think also that the communications that food banks often put out confuses the message or reinforces the message that charity is the solution. So, they're always putting out newsletters that encourage people that focus on the charitable elements of their work. Food banks need to also work on kind of communicating to the public more intentionally that the upstream solutions are the ones that are going to, essentially shorten the line and enable them to move away from the daily drip, drip, drip of the need. So it kind of works. There's a donor education element to this, as Greg is saying.
We want to give Andy some time to sell and sign some books. So I'll take a couple of last questions right beside you there, Ashley.
Hi, thanks for your comments, Andy, and the other panelists. Our organization has developed a food drive model that lets people donate fruits and vegetables instead of canned goods. I'm the father of 4 and have lived through many school food drives and food drive contests, and I empathize with you and your 9-year-old son. And we've launched something called the Give Healthy movement in partnership with Why Hunger, the Center for Science, and the CSPI, a bunch of universities and other organizations that are really interested in providing a way for people to donate healthy food and to heighten the public awareness that hunger is a health issue. We've worked with and talked to a lot of organizations, including the Stamp Out Hunger folks, where what we see in terms of what you illustrated in the Feeding America YouTube clip, that at the margin, a lot of these organizations are making decisions to advertise unhealthy food, essentially from the perspective of they don't have another source of money to get the thing done. And I'm imagining that while Walmart may have been a major funder of that PSA, the brands that were shown in there, the Pop-Tarts and whatnot, those brands are actually writing the checks that complete the budget so they can do something like that. And I haven't read your book yet. I haven't bought it yet, but I will. My question is, in terms of how embedded corporations that are making and selling unhealthy foods are embedded in the system, what's the pathway to start to back them out of it?
Sort of to de-Walmartize anti-hunger activism?
Well, to decouple, I mean, on one hand, what Greg pointed out in terms of, they are funding things that are very purposeful and are accomplishing good things. But they're also funding things that I think it's fair to say are not accomplishing good things. And is there a pathway to decouple that that's practical and achievable?
In some ways, I've struggled a lot with this issue about, is it just I ran an organization for a long time, and we made some decisions about, we had a very clear corporate donation policy after a while. It took us a while to get there, about what money we would take and what money we would not take. And at one point, Chipotle came to us and said, we want to give you $50,000 to do some cause marketing campaign with us. And we decided after much hand-wringing and angst that we would not take that money because there was a campaign against Chipotle by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers at the time. And given that there's an open kind of labor strife with that, we decided that it was more important to protect the food movement, to protect cohesion within the movement and not divide the movement, and then to take the money. They ended up writing us a check anyways, but we didn't have to enter into a public relationship with them. What I would say to that is it's difficult, and it's not something I can answer like it's a conversation. But to me, what's almost equally important about whether you take the money or not is what you do after you take the money. Do you not say things? Do you not do things? Do you change your public policy stance? Are there sins of omission, if you will, because you didn't take this money? And that's what I've seen time and time again in my years of anti-hunger work, is that people refrain from criticizing the hand that feeds them, or even more broadly. In other talks that I've done, I specifically get into that with Walmart. So is it a question of taking the money or not taking the money and getting away from it? Yeah, but it's also, like I said, okay, fine, take the money, but you should be making sure that you're staying true to your values and not being quiet because you've been bought off.
Thanks. Seems like a good note on which to conclude this and let you have the chance for people to buy your book. On behalf of the Institute, I'd like to announce that our next forum is on June 22nd, and there's a slide, but I'm not up there to put it up. It's at 5:30 in the evening, is that correct? All right, then Ashley will put it up, and the information about when to be here, it's here, when to be here, and the topic is the impact of technology on changing food jobs over the next 10 years. There it is. How will technology affect food workers in the next 10 years? So we'll see you here again on the 22nd of June.